Okay, Jackie. So Jacquelyn Shuman is one of our key people helping develop the FATES model, which both Dave and Will brought up, which is the functionally assembled terrestrial ecosystem simulator, which has come from the ecosystem demography model. Jackie can give you an introduction. She has a great background in fire and the role that fire plays in determining both biogeography and ecosystem composition. So I'll let Jackie take over.
Thank you, Peter. It's good to be here. So yeah, I'm Jacquelyn Shuman. I'll be talking about ecosystem dynamics and fire, essentially next generation modeling with FATES. And so FATES is very much a collaborative development process. We have teams here at NCAR and at multiple institutions, but there's a core team out at Lawrence Berkeley in California. Okay, am I advancing this or? Okay. There we go. So if we look at active fire counts from remote sensing, MODIS and VIIRS, you can see that this is for yesterday. You can see that there are a number of fires occurring globally. If we look across the past 3 weeks, you can see that there's a very broad geographic coverage for fire counts. Fire is a fundamental Earth system process. It's natural in a lot of ecosystems globally. But given the increases in fire, it's important for us to understand how it impacts humans, vegetation. It really crosses systems, impacts the atmosphere. You heard Simone's talk this morning. It can cause runoff changes. So it's a multi-scale, multi-system process with a lot of feedbacks. If we look at the long-term averages for global burned area, we can see that it's got a different picture than our active fire counts. But the majority of burning is happening within the tropics. So these dry savanna regions, particularly Africa, South America, and Australia. And so these long-term averages give us an idea of what the fire regime is. So the fire regime is the interaction of climate, vegetation, and ignitions over decades to centuries. Because this is somewhat in balance, even though it's a dynamic process with multiple feedbacks, vegetation systems with these high fire disturbance have evolved so that they can survive in the midst of these disturbance processes. And so plant distribution, biogeography, is shaped by the interaction of vegetation traits and fire disturbance. If you look at the map, it has observations of bark thickness. And so variation in bark thickness, 20% of the variation in bark thickness is explained by annual burned area. And so we have thin bark trees shown in blue, and then thick bark trees shown in red. And so these thick bark trees dominate across these areas of high disturbance in the tropics. And then on the left, I have a picture of thick bark trees from Brazil. And so if you look at South America, you can see that it has a high contrast of thin bark trees right next to thick bark trees. And so this comparison of these two traits, these two characterizations of bark thickness, is a good test to see how we do modeling this across the tropics. This is important because we've already seen increases in our fire season length. And so the map shown on the left shows you increasing fire season days in brown, and we expect those increases to continue. And so the maps on the right show you results from the CESM large ensemble looking at how climate impacts fire risk. And so the figure in the middle shows you areas of red increase, indicating extreme fire risk. And you can see as we move into the future with the figure at the bottom, globally we have extreme fire risk across much of our regions. And so these areas of thin bark trees compared to thick bark trees suggest a vulnerability in those systems that are seeing that change. This is important because across the tropics, we have critical high biomass stores. And so in particular, again, in South America, the area that we have these high biomass stores shown in red is coincident with these thin bark trees. suggesting a potential vulnerability. And so if we get a change in the fire regime, we have the capacity to alter these vegetation stores. Tropical forests hold nearly 200 gigatons of carbon above ground. And so the loss of these stores has the potential to be a large influx into the atmosphere. Oh, well, that's too bad. Hopefully this is the only figure that has this problem. So capturing fire within a model, it's important to remember that fire is interactive. And so fire interacts between the land and the atmosphere. You have differences between forests and grasses. You get a difference in wind speed. Forested areas have very tall vegetation that's going to slow down your winds. Within grassy areas, you get high, fast-moving fires. You have a difference in flammability. The fuels that you have in forests, they're a lot more than within grasses. CLM and CLM FATES capture all of those feedbacks, but CLM FATES gives you the additional feedback of capturing demography. And so how vegetation responds and recovers in response to fire disturbance. And so the reason we can do that is because of the differences in the way that we handle ecological processes. And so CLM has a very simplified picture of vegetation, and you heard about this yesterday. And it is essentially a big leaf, and then you have separate pools for your different types of vegetation. And those different types of vegetation do not interact with one another in CLM. FATES is a cohort model. And so what that does is it allows us to capture different sizes and types of vegetation with a count number density for each of those sizes. And then these vegetation, they compete with one another. And so on a grid cell within FATES, we have different patches indicating time since disturbance. And so each of these patches has very young vegetation, all the way up to mature forest. And so what this means is that FATES has a lot of variability and heterogeneity. And so this is just looking at a grid cell in a different way. And so within that grid cell, you can have a newly disturbed forest that has very small vegetation, all the way up to a mature old growth forest. So the fuels picture for fire disturbance is going to be very different on each of these patches. So FATES handles, if you choose to run with FATES handles all of the vegetation processes. And so we simulate plant cohort growth, death, and regeneration on sub-daily to daily time steps. CLM handles everything outside of the vegetation processes. Spitfire is a process-based fire behavior and effects model that operates on a daily time step. And so fires initiate based on a lightning strike under conditions that are hot, dry, and windy. And then when you have a fire, we evaluate 6 litter and fuel classes, the fuel load, geometry, and moisture. From that, we calculate fire intensity, the energy released from the fire. We get flame scorch height, evaluate crown damage, and then cambial damage, so heating of the bark. And then from that, we get size-based tree mortality. So vegetation mortality, trees have some protection from fire. So as trees grow taller, they accumulate more bark. Oh, my figures got really, my arrows became red trees. As trees grow taller, they accumulate more bark, offering them some protection from fire. As trees grow taller, their canopy can escape the flames, protecting their canopy from canopy damage. Grasses don't have protection from fire. If you have a successful fire, all of the grasses burn. For the study that I'm looking at is we want to see if FATES can capture the distribution of these thin bark trees versus thick bark trees. And so I have 3 types of vegetation. I have a thin bark tree with a large canopy, and then I have a thick bark tree with a thinner canopy, and I have C4 grasses. And so importantly, as fire comes through a patch, some of that tree canopy might survive. And so if you have a fire the next day, it's going to have different fire behavior. You've lost some of your fuels, and so things will change. So it's a dynamic feedback. If we look at simulations, so we have a FATES simulation with fire shown on the top, and then on the bottom, observations from remote sensing. And so this is accumulated biomass with the high biomass regions shown in the dark blues. So you can see that FATES captures the broad biomass accumulation patterns compared to observations, but we have areas where we're over predicting biomass, in particular, the Atlantic forests in South America. And these simulations do not include human impacts. And so we do not have clearing for cities or agriculture. And so this mismatch is not surprising. If we look at the disturbance patterns associated with this biomass accumulation, on the top, we have the FATES simulation, and then below that, we have observations of burning. And so you can see that FATES it has an overactive fire regime. We have a lot more fire than we do in the observations. In particular, we have these areas of black indicating repeat burns. And so a lot of these fires are low intensity, so they don't cause excessive mortality, but we need to understand why we have these excessive amount of fires. And so if we look at the distribution of the vegetation, we can see that these areas of repeat burning are coincident with areas that we have dominance of grasses. Grasses always burn when you have a successful fire. And so it's improving our grass fire behavior is an area of high priority. But if we go back and include the fire regime on top, and then the biomass accumulation on the bottom, you can see that the areas of high biomass accumulation occur in areas of low disturbance. This isn't surprising. If you don't have fires that can potentially kill your trees, they're going to grow and accumulate more biomass. And so we're capturing this feedback between vegetation and disturbance. But how do these plant traits contribute to this distribution? And so on the left, we have the observations of bark thickness with the thin bark trees shown in blue and the thick bark trees shown in red. And then on the right, we have rows with active fire showing on the top and then no fire on the bottom. And this is biomass distribution for the different plants. And so if you look at the thin bark tree on the top left, you can see that the distribution of thin bark biomass broadly corresponds to what we have in the observations. And then the thick bark tree occupies areas of higher disturbance. If we run a simulation without fire, we can see that the thin bark tree is able to compete and establish across South America, indicating that it is this fire disturbance creating this distribution. But what is the mechanism of mortality causing these differences? And so if we look at what's happening with size and tree-based mortality, we can see that it's this interaction with fire that's giving us this distribution. And so on the left, we have the pattern of burning. And then on the right, we have fire mortality separated out by tree size and the thin bark trees on the top, the thick bark trees on the bottom. And what we see are that the small trees of both types experience high levels of mortality, shown in the darker brown colors. But as the trees grow taller, they experience less mortality. The thick bark trees have more bark protection, and so they escape mortality more quickly than the thin bark trees, indicating that these feedbacks between vegetation traits and fire disturbance and size-related mortality is functioning as we would expect it to. So it confirms that this mechanism is working in the model, which is not a small feat. It's been a long road. But how does flammability contribute to what is burning and when? And so the results that I've been showing you are from the middle row. If we run a simulation where we increase the amount of fuel drying in association with the climate for these simulations, and so we have drier fuels. With drier fuels, we get more burning. With more burning, shown at the top, you get an increase in the amount of grass area, and then a loss for your thin bark trees. Contrasting that, if you have less burning, so if you have wetter fuels shown at the bottom, you lose the grasses can no longer compete with that fuel wetness, and then you get an increase in the distribution of thin bark trees. And so it's the interaction of both the connection to climate, so fuel drying, the amount of ignitions, how much fire you have, and then these plant traits that establish the plant distribution. And so the fact that we're able to capture this dynamic biogeography and overall biomass accumulation without prescribing where this vegetation should occur is a sign that we're heading in the right direction. And these fire feedbacks are critical for capturing this across the tropics. So if we step away from the work that I do and look at some of the other things that are happening in FATES, we have a lot of development going on associated with nutrients, plant hydraulics. We have additional firework that I'm putting in, deciduous phenology. We have the addition of moss, which is very exciting, canopy turbulence. And then we have multiple modes that you can run FATES in to investigate different questions. So there are a lot of possibilities with FATES. The FATES code is available publicly at the GitHub page here. We have searchable technical documentation and user's guide, and we also had a recent CTSM tutorial that has Jupyter notebooks, which would walk you through how to run a FATES simulation. And with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jackie. That was great. Obviously, a land-dominated couple of days. I apologize, but that's what, as I said, that's what happens when you put someone like that in charge of the tutorial. If you've got questions, obviously, like this is a really fabulous new development we have for the model, and it's obviously got great research potential. So if anyone would like to ask some questions about FATES, and I can see some interest here. Yes, we've got quite some time.
Thank you very much, Bob. I have two questions. One question is that have you done any future projections to see whether wildfires is getting more frequent or more intense in the future in FATES? And another question is that from atmospheric chemistry background, I'm curious whether FATES can be coupled with maybe CAM or maybe WACAM to provide some information about biomass burning, and maybe those information can be later used to simulate any further chemical processes in the atmosphere.
Yeah, these are great questions. And so the next step for the work that I'm doing will be to look at what happens in future climates. And so I haven't done that yet. I need to write up this paper. It's been, and then we've tested FATES, and it does run in the coupled model, but we haven't evaluated it. And so FATES is running globally, but we're still doing calibration of the global distribution of plants and the biomass accumulation. And so it's high on our agenda of things to do. And so we need to confirm that all of the pieces are communicating with each other. Right now, the coupling does function. We don't break the model, so to speak, but we have to do some calibration.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward for the couple in between CAM.
Join us.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very nice. I have one question. So if I'm not mistaken, the source code of the FATES, there is the fire ignition probability is also dependent on the GDP and the population density at the place. And I know that usually this is done in a you can say one direction coupling, that, okay, you take the GDP and population density and then you compute the ignition. But I was wondering, we have seen that in the future, the probability of extreme fires will increase dramatically over the entire globe. And I'm wondering if this will not arrive at a moment when forest fires will undermine the socioeconomical development, which means that the local population and socioeconomical development GDP can be affected, right? So we can suppose that maybe the uncertainty related to the scenarios in terms of population and GDP can be strongly affected by strong fires. So I'm wondering if this line of research is investigated. We can imagine how the GDP will become lower because of economical losses related to maybe wood harvesting and so on, or population will migrate, for example, and therefore will be lower chance of ignition. Thank you.
It's an excellent question, and I should clarify. So these simulations, it's like a world without humans. And so I do not have anthropogenic ignitions. You're absolutely correct that the way that anthropogenic ignitions are handled is with an association to GDP. This is usually handled at a regional level. And so like all of the United States has a similar ignition probability associated with humans. The highest uncertainties associated with fire models, and this includes FATES-SPITFIRE, as well as the CLM base model, as well as many other global Earth system models that have a fire component. The highest uncertainties are associated with how we handle humans, their ignitions, as well as land cover land use change. And you're exactly right. A lot of them are empirical functions for ignitions associated with GDP. It's an empirical function linking, population, the economic status of the country, as well as some arbitrary idea of how far they are, how far apart cities are. So in Russia, you would not have as much fire suppression because it's such a large country. And so their city centers are not close to one another, but those are static. And so they do not change going into the future. And so you're absolutely correct that projecting into the future with increasing fire regimes and increasing burning, you get this feedback of fuels, but then you also potentially would get a feedback of how people are handling land management or where they're living. And so it's an area identified as a problem or an area of development for fire modeling specifically, and the human component is an essential part of that. But we don't have the answer right now. Everyone is saying we need to do better.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I think it's a very interesting line of research. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for the great talk. My question is contrasting slide 3 and 4, where the conclusion was the thick bark tree are seen in the area where there's dominant fire. We see that pattern in South America, but there is a South Africa region and there is a Northern Australia where the thin bark trees and the fire probabilities or fire counts are very, very high. Did you investigate those regions as well?
And so I haven't split out the tropical, the full pan-tropical simulations in terms of where the thick bark tree survives. But given the similarities to the disturbance regime across South America, I would expect that it's only the thick bark trees, but I haven't looked it out. I haven't pulled that out for Africa and Australia. It's a good question. I need to make that figure.
Thank you.
Hey, there's been a lot of cool work on hysteresis of forests and savanna states at intermediate rainfall, and fire is a big driver of that. Has that been explored in FATES?
So that was the original motivation for the work that I was doing, was to look at the difference between forests and savanna areas. And so I sort of transitioned into this mechanism of tree mortality because representation of grasses was a big challenge. And so C4 grasses in particular, the C4 grasses have a different photosynthetic pathway. And when I first introduced the C4 grasses, they took over the world. And they were like, we are happy to exist everywhere and they can exist with disturbance. And so I figured out how to calm the C4 grasses. But the result of this is this overactive fire regime. And so investigating the connection between grass and fire, and then also the distribution, the balance of where savannas occur that are dominated by grasses and where you have coexistence with trees, is an area of active research. And so these results do not answer that question, but I'm sort of looking into it. And so at the moment, there's not a lot of coexistence of trees and grasses. And so that transition between a tree savanna versus a grass savanna, I need to go in and do more site level testing for that. But we have our colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley are actually doing a lot of development with grasses, and we've made some updates. And so we're hoping that that research is based in California. It's looking at all the state of California, but that will inform the work in South America as well.
Excited to see what happens with that. It's really cool. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks.
Great. Well, I think that concludes the application talks. So thanks again, Jackie and Wei.